Hello and welcome to the land down under, where the beer flows free and men chunder. Your hosts Frank and Gaz will seek to wrestle the latest technology, including AI voice actors such as myself. Their goal? To take a cross-disciplinary deep dive into the Beatles' 1964 Australasian tour.
Australia. Think of satiric colony with 4 musicians going through it. Hello, Delbert. How's Wagga Wagga?
I did but see her passing by, and yet I love her till I die.
Australia pipped it by, I don't know, by the amount of older people as well that were sort of at airports and standing around the street, which made the Australian reception the biggest we've ever had.
Well, welcome back to They Came to a Land Down Under, our deep dive into the Beatles' Australasia tour. And in this episode, The Lucky Land, we'll be exploring what did the Beatles think they would find in Australia? What was Australia really like, culturally, politically, socially?
Hello, Australia. This is John Lennon of the Beatles here. I hope you're all having a great time over there.
This is Paul speaking. We're hoping to come over soon.
Complete this sentence. Australia is a lucky country.
That's right.
Yeah.
Australia's a lucky country.
Complete the sentence.
Run by second-rate people.
Run mainly by second-rate people who share its luck. It lives on other people's ideas. Who's this?
Oh, that'd be
This is Donald Horne.
The famous Donald Horne.
He was an Australian journalist, writer, social critic, academic. And what's the significance behind this lucky country idea that people sort of got so wrong? And that was written in, I think that's actually written in 1964.
I suspect he was trying to tell us that it's a bit like the land of the Lotus Eater. You know, like they all pretty laid back and pretty happy with themselves, but really, you know, it's not as great as they think it is, or they're certainly not as good as they think they are.
Uh-huh.
It came to be Australia's own version of exceptionalism. This notion that, you know, we're this blessed place and we're lucky and isn't that great?
The parallel there with the Down Under song that people thought that was just a celebration of this greatness of the Australian spirit.
It was a continuation of that, of transferring that message into exceptionalism rather than taking it as a bit of a warning.
I've got a statistic here that about 98.9% of Victorians professed Christianity in the early 1960s, and that radio stations featured something like 283 hours a week of religious programming. I can't imagine what
283
Is there, are there enough hours in the week for that? Tony Robinson, not the Baldrick character, but a historian who wrote about the liberation of a teenage generation in 2014. This quote here: "No expression of rectitude was stronger than Melbourne's enduring Sunday coma, a day devoted almost exclusively to religious observance, a city remarkably devoid of commercial activity and commercial entertainment."
And I don't think Melbourne was unique. It may have been a paragon of that particular virtue of the time, but I don't think it was unique at all.
Mm-hmm.
I think Sunday was a quiet day. And in fact, shops shut on Saturday at midday.
Mm-hmm.
There was no trading. You couldn't buy anything.
Couldn't whip out to the Bunnings or the...
You couldn't be out to the Bunnings or your local IGA.
There'd be no sausage sizzle.
The other thing that strikes me is what a sectarian place it was, how important religion was, not just from from a straight religious perspective in terms of observance and faith and so forth, but socially, politically.
Control of the church through schools and everything was really strong.
Absolutely, it was. Yeah. And the Beatles demonstrating a perhaps more of an exuberance would have been frowned upon. Girls screaming like that in public are very unbecoming.
I'm staying away from school, and the headmistress of our school said she's going to prosecute me for being away the other day. And I'd like to see her try it. I'm going to like our girls' junior high school. I hope that's on the news, mate.
What class are you in?
3D.
We'd had the 1954 tour of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, which was considered highly successful and at that point potentially even a challenge to the crowds that the Beatles drew. But by the time you get to 1963, the Bulletin magazine was noting there was a sort of, quote, weary cynicism of the tour, which is interesting, citing young people as being a bit blasé and Queen watchers as, quote, matrons. But yet Craig McGregor argues that even mid-decade, we were more royalist and less critical of the throne than Britain itself. Commentators tend to say that at the head of this nostalgia towards the monarchy was Prime Minister Robert Menzies.
Our Prime Minister, Robert Gordon Menzies, has always proved himself with words a man who is more than equal to the moment.
No better demonstrated than what I will use the term fulsome in the true sense of the word fulsome, which is often interpreted incorrectly these days. Welcoming of the Queen in the 1963
Can I just
tour.
correct you, please? You mean Her Majesty?
I'm sorry, Her Majesty, in our Parliament in Canberra or some function.
I did but see her passing by, and yet I love her till I die.
What a remarkable moment that's played many times over in documentaries on the history of Australia, right? The high point of our sort of respect for royalty.
And amongst certain sections of society, the high point of our cringeworthiness. It is remarkable, and he also claimed that he was British to his bootstraps. Born in Australia, in Victoria, country Victoria, he was a man of the people. His father or grandfather was a skilled tradesman, very bright individual. Scholarships to Melbourne University, ends up in the correct circle.
Yeah.
He genuinely had deep identification with England as the cultural beacon.
Around the time that the Beatles were about to touch down here at Mascot in Sydney, he'd been Prime Minister for 14 years. He was off to London for some cricket.
Sir Robert Menzies, Australia. Mrs. Bandaranaike, Ceylon.
He very much was still tied to the motherland wherever he could be. And it's interesting that when England, when there was talk of England moving to the common market, the Australians, himself and the Deputy Prime Minister at the time, lobbied very hard in England against that because they thought that would be strongly counter to Australia's interest. And any dissent from that view was very harshly frowned upon by him.
Right.
And what saved the day, of course, was that Charles de Gaulle vetoed England's entry into the common market. By the time that the Beatles came, he was really starting to consolidate his power. I mean, he hung on in the early 60s. There had been economic turbulence. There had been high inflation and a credit squeeze. And while he won the election in the early 60s, it was only by a couple of seats, I think, from memory. But by 63, he consolidated his grip on power. He was great at capitalising on the divisions inside the Labor Party, particularly between the Democratic Labor Party and the broader Labor Party, which the split occurred in the mid-50s, and that was because of communism. So one passion was monarchy, the hate though was communism. One commentator said it seems as if all of his great energy and passions were always driven by things overseas. One is his love of monarchy, and secondly his hate of communism.
Association, just as the communist powers and their overseas friends will work incessantly to divide and destroy it.
For international listeners who think that Australia is so far away and untouched by Cold War politics, it couldn't be further from the truth. The date the Beatles arrived was a decade after we'd had a spy scandal ourselves in the name of the Petrov affair. And a subsequent Royal Commission, which had political implications arising from it.
That's right. That's right. Well, if you take a step back, one characteristic of Australia at the time, from early in the century right through to the 60s, was it was a very both a conservative and sort of proudly nationalistic place. The lucky country sort of reflects that. But I think I sometimes leave it to poets to sort of describe that, and it's interesting that there's the most famous Australian poem, I think, is by Dorothy McKellar, which is and it sums it up for me. And the second stanza, and everyone in Australia knows it well. You know, I'm pretty sure they'll recognise it.
So not Kookaburra lives in the old gum tree.
No, it's not quite as good as that. I love a sunburnt country. A land of sweeping plains, of rugged mountain ranges, of droughts and flooding rains. I love her far horizons, I love her jewel See her beauty and her terror, the wide brown land for me. This is 1908, and it becomes Australia's most favourite sort of poem. I think it tells you a lot about Australia. The essence, the nature of the place, it's both big, beautiful, but also a bit terrifying. Right? She refers to that in the poem, you know.
And now some words from our 1964 sponsors.
Superb aircraft, VOAC spent 2 years of research in developing the finest seats to be found in the air. And the inner man has to be satisfied, even at 40,000 feet, with nothing to do but recline in comfort. The problems of keeping the passengers well fed have been completely solved by the backroom boys.
But if you think about two endpoints in this Beatles history here, was it 1967? Probably was. When they were on the first multinational, multi-satellite TV broadcast.
A moment in television history, because this programme will bring together more places throughout the world than has ever been possible before. Live pictures from across the world will be brought to us here in Britain. At the same time, they will reach millions of viewers.
Right, and they sang All You Need Is Love, right? You go back to 1964 and it seems like generations ago in terms of technology. Here you have in Australia, you don't even have a cable connecting Melbourne and Sydney.
Correct.
For television.
That's right.
And yet in 3 years' time, the Beatles are there joining the world.
That's right.
So in November 1963 in Australia, Melbourne and Sydney just got connected, allowing for the first time the instant sharing of content. £100,000 a year cost, right?
Have you applied the deflator?
I haven't done the deflator. Okay, I haven't done the contemporary value of that. But it was described as the equivalent cost of building a major television station studio every year.
Whoa.
So this was first used by the Nine Network for live coverage between Sydney, Melbourne and Canberra. So this meant it was technically possible now to actually have one interconnected market. But so parochial is the Sydney-Melbourne rivalry that culturally it's much harder to connect than technically.
Alan, I'd just like to say how much better, and I hate to say this, how much better the Melbourne weather is being to the Beatles than was Sydney. A torrential downpour occurred just as they arrived. So they got out.
We are going slowly on this one, a TCN9 executive told TV Times in November 1963. We hope that by getting together and creating a greater intercity awareness through the news and other programs, we can gradually break down these local tastes. We want to create a climate where Sydneysiders will accept Melbourne's atmosphere and personalities, and vice versa. Unless we can do this, it's doomed for live programming in Australia.
The Beatles landing in is this going to be the moment that sort of helps to unify this kind of, maybe I haven't counted that in the Beatles' achievements.
Well, never underestimate, I think, the importance of celebrity as a unifying
driver,
as a unifying force. But look, they were up against it. They were up against it because everyone knew back then that, Taurian beer was the best beer in Australia. The worst beer in Australia was Queensland. Although the South Australians would contest that the best beer was from Melbourne because, they had the Coopers.
Yes, of course.
And Tasmanians.
Boutique before boutique was a thing.
As you know, Tasmanians are very proud of their beer as well. In an age where things were produced locally, it was inevitable there was going to be this diversity and non-unification, this diversity of stuff. We didn't have as many national companies.
30 years later, when I made my way from the great state of Tasmania to the national capital, I was in a state of incredible confusion in walking into a bar and not knowing whether I should be saying, can I have a 12-ounce?
I went to a bar once and asked for a schooner, and the guy said, what a boat's got to do with it? So this was very ingrained.
So just post-Beatles trip November of that year, Prime Minister Robert Menzies announces the reintroduction of national service.
Oh, yes.
Robert Hughes, the great art critic, calls 1964, quote, the last year of its political virginity. So we have some major changes going on. We have conscription. We have some aspects of what has been described and called the White Australia policy, even though some would argue that that term doesn't necessarily formally exist in formal legislation or anything, but it's a way to have described the policy.
Yes.
Designed to essentially keep Australia British. That was still in place, though with significant changes to take effect even just a couple of years later. And Menzies himself was very much, as I understand, somebody who really did continue to talk about the advantage of a homogeneous population.
As long as we possibly can, we ought to aim at having a homogeneous population. I don't want to see reproduced in Australia the kind of problem they have in South Africa, or in America, or increasingly in Great Britain. I think it's been a very good policy, and it's been of great value to us.
But to be fair, it was a bipartisan policy.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
I shouldn't be calling out either side.
It was introduced. It was one of the first acts of Parliament of the new federation, 1901, and it was a continuation of policies that all the colonies had. All the colonies had.
Yeah.
So this is a long-standing cultural tradition in Australia. Was
Malcolm McHarris from a 1980s book called Australia in the 60s says, at this point, though, the White Australia policy became a matter of increasing public debate. During that first half of the decade, the instincts of Menzies was to keep the policy while allowing a small annual intake of Asian citizens who would assimilate properly into the Australian community.
After the Qantas aircraft that brought me from Jakarta touched down in Darwin, the first Australian port of landing, 2 hefty medical health inspectors boarded the plane. Except for me, all the passengers were white Europeans or Americans. The health inspectors wasted no time in declaring that all passengers except me were medically in good shape and could land. As you can see on my medical certificate, I have been vaccinated for smallpox, typhoid, yellow fever. The lot except kangaroo fever. He did not appreciate this. The previous official expression on his round face changed to one of exasperation. Don't get bloody cheeky with me, or get any stupid idea about racial discrimination. The colour of anybody's skin doesn't make any bloody difference to us in Australia. Get that through your head. Now be a good bloke and bloody well stay here until I get back, he said in a calmer manner. Your kind comes through here every day. We're only making sure of your health.
Excerpt from An African Abroad by Nigerian journalist Olabisi Ajala, 1963.
It's really interesting because the experience of the war, particularly the threat from Japan, really put the wind up Australians' perception of itself.
Mm-hmm.
Here we are, 7 million people, and here we have these behemoths to our north. And Caldwell was the one that said, if we don't expand, in the future, we might just be overrun. We need to populate or perish.
Populate or perish. Ideas started to motivate.
And so they wanted to have, they opened up the gates to migration. They were hoping they'd get about 7 or 8 UK citizens for every non-UK citizen. As it turned out, it was about the other way around. It wasn't quite enough. With the demands of industrialisation, they needed more and more migrants. They turned to Southern Europe with the Italians, hence my existence here. And the Greeks.
Hence my partner. Yeah.
Yep.
Yes,
what a great decision
indeed.
that was.
Because as my father-in-law, I know we're going off tangent here, talks about, he remembers only finding olive oil at the chemist in Australia.
That's exactly
right. And that's
right.
probably not far off the time the Beatles arrived here.
That's exactly right. Medicinal purposes only. Friends of ours who first came here in the late 50s couldn't even buy pasta in the shops, and they went and got tin spaghetti, rinsed the tomato sauce out of it, and that didn't last very long because it just wasn't edible.
I spent some of the summer holiday in the beautifully chilled rooms of the National Library and Archives, and I've been fortunate enough to have access, thanks to the Art Centre of Melbourne, to some historical documents that may rarely have been seen or heard of outside Australia.
Right.
And
brought to you first here.
On this podcast. Some correspondence from the Australian Department of Immigration based in the Commonwealth Centre, Elizabeth Street, Sydney. and this is on the 24th of April 1964, just before the tour, posing the idea, would you be interested in the possibility of cooperating in a publicity idea intended to assist us with our immigration publicity overseas? So you're hearing it here first. We thought we might be able to link the visit of the Beatles to Sydney with the impressive story of British migration to Australia, with particular reference to the families who have come to Australia from Liverpool area. It is obvious that we would get widespread publicity in the United Kingdom, and since we have an urgent need for more skilled workers, it is the department's wish to exploit every opportunity.
Only a small number of immigrants would be included, but the emphasis would naturally be on young people. If you agree, we might also include a few interesting and attractive young immigrants from the continent, as well as those from Liverpool. This would be to gain good magazine publicity in Europe in addition to the British press.
And now some words from our 1964 sponsors.
The students and general public alike too can obtain the best hair care at Melbourne's most reasonable prices. There's a gymnasium where students can exercise at any time they feel inclined. No extra charge. You can always have a shower and make up before going out to a show. You remember the best place to go for the best poise and deportment in the Ellie Lucas School of Elegance finishing course. That's the School of Elegance at 52 Rossiter Street here in Melbourne town, where beauty can be learnt. Ellie Lucas, bring you this part of the official Beatle motorcade as we go back.
It was in 1847 that the first vines were planted, and in every succeeding year the traditional wines have been produced, some of them world-class prize winners. What then remained to be achieved in the Barossa Valley?
So what was your reaction to that?
Oh, well, I mean, I'm chuffed because I'm sure that, had I been old enough, I would have been selected amongst a good-looking group and been part of the crowd. But isn't that fascinating that they're using the Beatles tour as a mode of promotion of Australia to migrants in England and possibly other countries. And this was something the Department of Immigration was doing quite frequently. Continental is certainly a big marker of difference between Britishness, Great Britain, and the continent. All those French and Germans and, which are all a bit sus. Well, they're not quite as white,
Yeah, what does it look like? Yeah.
What's the idea of crying all
I've
the
got
time?
Ringo's and Paul McCartney cigarettes. Why won't they come back? Because those stupid Brisbane idiots threw stupid-looking stuff at them. That's not fair to the Sydney bloke.
This takes me to gender, right? So this is a very interesting period. We had the pill introduced in 1961, but it was initially only available to married women. Eventually, it allowed more control over reproductive decisions, more women into the workforce, so that was a big, obviously, social change, not only in Australia but elsewhere, right? In April 1964, the Menzies government refused to ratify the International Labour Organisation Convention on Equal Pay for Women.
That's correct.
That's right in the year that the Beatles arrived.
That wouldn't happen until some 6 or so years later when equal pay was given to women in the late 60s. It's a really interesting point you make because I do not think you can overestimate
how important that was.
The impact of the pill, which became available in 1963. According to the British poet laureate, Philip Larkin, sexual intercourse was invented in 1963. This is the poet laureate Larkin himself saying, and it comes from his poem, famous poem, called Annus Mirabilis, The Wonderful Year, right? And I just read you the...
Okay,
please. It's very short.
Please.
And it says, sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me. Between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP, up until then there'd only been a sort of bargaining, a wrangle for the ring, a shame that started at 16 and spread to everything. Then all at once the quarrel sank. Everyone felt the same. And every life became a brilliant breaking of the bank, a quite unlosable game. So life was never better than in 1963, though just too late for me, between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP.
Well, there you go. Isn't that incredible?
That's incredible. So we can actually date the beginning of sex to the release of that groundbreaking first album of the Beatles. Please
be.
Look, do we need to draw it out?
Case, what do we say?
QED.
And we can add that to the list of incredible achievements that we've been discussing previously. I remember this from, I think, my mother's experience, who worked for a Commonwealth institution of some kind, and that basically, the decision to marry was a decision to terminate your employment, essentially, at that point.
Yes.
This was only abolished in 1966.
Correct.
Apparently. Marriage was forced retirement for most Australian women. Somewhere in one part of the Australian government system, there was a very serious challenge going on in terms of contemplating the role of women in their senior leadership. And this is the Australian Trade Commission, which we know a little bit about through our life.
Yes,
so I'm familiar with our overseas trade promotion functions, right?
Correct.
And they look deeply into this question of, could we have women trade commissioners? A bit like women priests nowadays.
That's
like many years on.
Oh, this is profound. It's a profound question. I mean,
we're seeing it in many professions now, right?
Yeah. Could you rely on women to adequately represent?
Could they do this job?
Could they do the job, represent Australia?
In part of my trip to the archives and National Library and digging deeply into this topic over the summer, this is one of the favourite discoveries, right? It's a minute on women trade commissioners from March 1963. So
when you say a minute, it's a briefing.
A briefing note.
Even after some deliberation, it is difficult to find reasons to support the appointment of women trade commissioners. In countries where media is well developed, such as North America and England, where there are no other major drawbacks, such as the Islamic attitude towards women, a relatively young, attractive woman could operate with some effectiveness in a subordinate capacity.
This is a thoroughly considered brief.
If we had trade in women's clothing, a woman might promote this more effectively than a man would.
That's certainly a big market, right? So there's some forethought.
There is.
Even conceding these points, such an appointee would not stay young and attractive, and later on could well become a problem. It is difficult to visualize them as trade commissioners, firstly because they could not mix nearly as freely with businessmen as men do.
I mean, that's right. It would be seen as unseemly, perhaps. I'm not sure.
It would be someone, another person's.
We are talking the early 60s.
Someone's partner married,
I mean, it's Mad Men territory.
Relationships with businessmen would tend to be somewhat formal and guarded on both sides. This would make it more difficult for a woman to obtain information. It is extremely doubtful if a woman could, year after year, stand the fairly severe strains and stresses, mentally and physically, which are part of the life of a trade commissioner.
Another cocktail, another round of canapes. It's tough. It's tough.
A man normally has his household run efficiently by his wife, who also looks after much of the entertaining. A woman trade commissioner would have all this on top of her normal work. If we recruited from the business world, we would have a much smaller field from which to recruit, as the number of women executives in business is quite small. A spinster lady can, and very often does, turn into something of a battle axe with the passing years. A man usually mellows.
Did he just say battle axe? There's a lot of risk there. There's a lot of risk.
There's a 2018 address by Justice Virginia Bell, well-known former High Court judge, at the Francis Forbes lecture on 30 May in Sydney of that year, talking about her experience even in the sort of later part of the 60s in Australia, so still within the decade at least. She reported the notion that as a woman lawyer, you were at risk of losing your femininity if you did not take steps to keep a pretty steady grip on it. And that idea still had currency, she said, when she started law at University of Queensland in 1969. I was one of two women in my year, and the girls in the higher years were kind enough to hold a function for us at which, over glasses of sparkling blue porphyry pearl, we were given tips on how we could maintain our femininity despite being law students. So there you go.
Yeah. Well, that's very powerful evidence. I mean, porphyry pearl was considered quite a sophisticated drink.
Brandy as it should be.
The peak body of Australia's emerging wine industry had mounted a new marketing campaign in 1964 that was picking up on the trend of women as customers. So there's this kind of like starting to have these social freedoms that were coming, as we talked about. They're promoting, for example, sherry as the anytime friendly drink appropriate to serve when he gets home.
When he gets home.
Yeah. Here, an academic in 2021 says, well, look, operating within the ethos as Australia's biggest selling women's magazine, these advertisements target women not simply as consumers of wine, but agents of change.
Well, it was a very clever tactic on the part of the wine. Was it the Wine Council?
Australian Wine Board.
Very
well ahead of its...
Very well, yeah. And I might say, tapping into the zeitgeist which Menzies himself was tapping into when he gave a famous speech about the Forgotten Australians.
Ooh, there's a connection.
A very famous speech where he appealed to the quiet Australian.
And now some words from our 1964 sponsors.
Men working in this plant have come to Australia from Europe to settle with their families in the garden town of Elizabeth.
This is official B-Day, Beatle Arrival Day, and here is Alan Lappin brought you of the Beatle motorcade to the Southern Cross Hotel. Talking about Revlon just a moment ago, you can't go wrong with Revlon, girls, the world's finest range of cosmetics. Maselli Lucas, a favourite among leading...
The business people, the shop owners, and he emphasised the importance of home.
Okay.
And, of course, that brings women right into the centre of the political thinking.
So you think he was
right?
sort of...
So he's picking up on this middle-class notion that, a more genteel view of drinking, but he's bringing women...
so he's trying to capture the women vote.
That women vote. And
he's
in
trying
fact,
to stay relevant.
He was very popular, and the female vote was arguably what got him across the line in under 63.
Well, there you go. What a connection we've just made from that random discussion. I mean, but listen to this. This resonates with this. Emphasising democratisation and informality, the campaign encouraged women to embrace wine consumption as an aid to creating a satisfactory domestic life, an appealing image of themselves.
Domestic life
reflected the changing social attitudes to alcohol consumption and, the role of women in society.
And just to take that a little further, of course, the predominant drink of the day was beer. Beer was overwhelmingly, no one drank wine. I mean,
wine was continental.
Well, it was even more than that. It was like we're speaking to people from that generation. Wine was plonk.
Plonk,
it was the winos.
But it still could be a few years later beyond the time the Beatles left before women might be able to go into the part of the bar that men.
Absolutely.
Or they would be in having a shandy in the ladies.
Most Australian and New Zealand hotels shut their public bars at 6 p.m. By the time the Beatles arrived in 1964, only 2 Australian states, South Australia and Victoria, retained such restricted trading hours.
This was a thing which was introduced after World War I and continued on in all states. It was the temperance movement saying it'd be better for the moral fibre of the country if people drank less, and it was allied or done in conjunction with the need for austerity during the war. And it stayed. It hung around. It stayed. And the effect of that, of course, was that men would leave their place of employment at about 4:30. Rush to the pub.
No different to that.
To the pub. Well, this was industrial times, mate. Industrial times. This is working class here. They'd leave the factory. They'd go to the pub. The beers would be lined up ready for them, and there'd be an almighty rush to get as drunk as possible by 6 o'clock, because then it was all over. Right? It was all over.
Had a name.
The
6 o'clock swill.
6 o'clock swill. That's exactly right.
And then everybody, children and mothers at home, then were waiting.
We're waiting for the husband to
get home. Great anticipation to what state they got in when they got home.
Oh, they would have been in a
no?
relaxed.
All men mellow, right? So we know.
Relaxed, jocular state, and they'd sit down to a family meal.
37 people on board. We were served with a special meal, which included kangaroo tail soup, served in special Beatle mugs with pictures of the boys. Now, that's the closest that Paul has got to a kangaroo, and it's his ambition to see a kangaroo whilst in Australia. Some special Queensland mud crabs flown down too for the flight. It was a very good meal. The boys enjoyed a relaxed flight in anticipation of this hectic welcome here.
Some of England's most popular restaurants have gained their fame for the excellence of their hot, hearty steak and kidney puddings. This is not a dish for delicate appetites. It is substantial fare. But so good, it's guaranteed to get the men of the family looking for second helpings.
I actually don't think the Beatles would have had many complaints about that, being their Northern English, fairly working class, plain diet of...
They would have been at home, right?
There were no shows to this thing in Adelaide Hills where the local establishment would put all this.
Rather embarrassing.
Embarrassing, but on top of that, they really did eschew the fancy offerings of the city elite and considered at the time in the hotels, demanding plates of jam butties.
Johnny babies have been thrown again, and does this worry you?
Yeah, I don't like them at all, because they're so dangerous when they come in big numbers like it does at the show.
Described as Australia's version of Julia Child. We had Margaret Fulton.
Margaret Fulton. Yes, remember her well.
Remember? She was recruited to Women's Day in 1960 as the food editor. In another one of these tangential links, she actually baked the birthday cake for Paul McCartney for the 22nd birthday party, which we'll talk about in a later episode. So this is early days. She was travelling the world and introducing readers to dishes beyond the traditional grills and roasts that were very much a feature of Australian family menus.
I wasn't too keen on New Zealand, I must admit, but most of Australia was nice. I think Adelaide I liked most of all. Would you like to come back?
Let's talk a little bit about, if we can, a little bit about New Zealand, because I do have relatives there, and I think, over the years I might have been accused of
endearing condescension?
Yeah, endearing. You've got the words there.
I remember on that tour, we had a Sunday off and we were sitting watching TV in the hotel room, and there was a program on the coal mining industry, then a program on the fishing industry. All day long it was like the weirdest TV we'd ever seen. Ringo Starr.
For 45 years. What changes he's seen in that time?
Could you tell us what the land in eastern Southland was like?
Well, in the main, I would say it had a...
In many respects, the country's geographical position in the far South Pacific had cocooned it from the rest of the world. And it was commented that really rugby, racing and beer held sway in New Zealand culture. And this was the golden age. Most of the country pretty much was just focused on the golden age of the All Blacks, who'd lost only 4 of 41 tests by 1960.
They're now just walking below us. Ringo Starr is right below us now. They're walking around the corner of the building on this low balcony. The crowd doesn't seem to have realised that that's them.
Recently, I welcomed home a fine bunch of athletes, the All Black rugby team, who had been playing football for New Zealand. They didn't get a mayoral welcome. If we are going to pander to the hysteria, the adulation, the screaming and the rioting, I think we should at least honour our youth. I find it difficult to get excited over these bewigged musicians.
The National Party swept to power in 1960 and remained there until 1972 under Kiwi Keith Holyoake. His political and social vision was best summed up by his 1963 election slogan, quote, "Steady as she goes."
Australia was more ethnically diverse. It had great people from Great Britain and Ireland. Whereas, New Zealand, I think, had people from Scotland. Yeah.
The country relied heavily on shipping for transport, of course, with only a rudimentary international air link with Australia. London to New Zealand, travel time improved with a twice-weekly jet service. So this was starting to open up their horizons. 37 hours flying time. Saturdays were set aside for playing sport, Sundays for church. Shops stayed open late on Friday nights and closed at weekends.
Well,
the entire weekend,
very familiar.
Entire weekend, sale of alcohol was severely restricted, with bars closing at 6 every evening, as we talked about, except Sundays when they were closed all day. The consumption of alcohol was prohibited in dance halls and restaurants. As Graham Hutchins, the author of 8 Days a Week, the Beatles tour of New Zealand 1964, published in the early 2000s, he says, in New Zealand, 6 o'clock closing was an unpleasant stain on the landscape. Just you wait till your father gets home type of sentiments continued to impart discipline and a towing of the line. That often meant the repudiation of Elvis Presley records. The major relief being a radio network and limited television service. Cinemas played the British national anthem.
The Beatles are not royalty or war heroes, nor even triumphant All Blacks. They are 4 young men who look and talk like stewards of an English ship. John's shoes showed no evidence of recent polishing. Wellington Evening Post, 1964.
Now, this is a really disturbing trend, but male culture also in New Zealand was quite a worrying environment to be in for some people because there was a tendency for drunken shearers or even sober ones for that matter, being known to shear the hair of any male who wasn't short back and sides. And the Beatles really came on the radar, as we'll see in later episodes.
Ringo, have you heard this record that the Howard Morrison group here in New Zealand have got a big hit with called I Want to Cut Your Hair?
No, not yet. I've heard all about it, though.
Does that mean there was like all these desperate shearers running around trying to get the Beatles and sort of give them a good haircut? Is this a phenomenon?
In New Zealand, they encountered quite a negative reception in some parts.
Because of the land,
and the conservatism of the country. And while there are people obviously writing about it who are great fans and describe it as also having the transformational effect that it's had here, in the same sorts of terms. The police authorities refuse to even treat them as a worthy subject.
Furor that's been created in Auckland about the civic reception, which is costing £60 of the ratepayers' money.
No, my God, they should be broke after that because the mayor wanted to give us a civic reception. And as usual, a few fuddy-duddies thought, well, they're not royalty, don't give them one. But the mayor was very good.
Certainly fresh egalitarianism there.
Yeah. But it said here in some of the literature that the signs of stirring among the younger generation were also happening in New Zealand. It was observed by one publication in 1965 that opposition to the war was causing New Zealanders to behave, quote, in ways quite uncharacteristic. Something was happening here in the 60s,
but
right?
We don't know what
we
it
don't
is.
know quite what it is yet. I mean, we had huge drivers of change, the population changing dramatically with the post-war baby boom, immigration program, the teenage market, overseas investment creating new industries and jobs, and I guess events that would have Australia in particular shifting its international gaze.
But these are nice kids in another city. God Save the Queen cuts all their screaming short. They stand to attention. It was not as rough as sport. No one was hurt.
Talked about women's issues a little bit, and I just might add, it's interesting that in 1963, the year that sexual intercourse was invented, was also the year that Betty Friedman came out with her Feminine Mystique in the US, ushering in a period where women really questioned that the only fulfillment they could get was through house duties and so forth. And that really kick-started the second wave feminist movement, which, of course, took off in earnest in the late 60s and early 70s, which I think the Beatles, in a sense, some commentators say they contributed to it, and certainly weren't impediments to it. Their songs were women-friendly, and women could see that these guys came from ordinary backgrounds.
You hear in a few interviews John Lennon mentioning, we're disappointed we haven't seen any Aboriginal people, so where was his consciousness of that? Actually invited an Indigenous person staying in one of their hotels come up and talk to us.
Can you imagine that happening today?
Yeah. I know. And he was a jockey staying in the hotel in Brisbane.
Well, we were disappointed we didn't see any Aborigines.
It's really important to note that we're still at a time when they were not counted for the census, where they were still being taken off stations. It was an utterly different world. That also was affected by movements overseas, particularly in the US, where the civil rights movement really takes off in 63, right, through Martin Luther King's agitations.
Yeah.
And there was echoes and reverberations back to Australia where black activists went on the freedom rides and marches around country towns in Australia, deliberately going and swimming in places where in pools, where black kids were not allowed, deliberately going into pubs. A real time of changing from a really alien sort of a place, if we look at it now from our perspective, to something far more familiar.
Ken Brodziak, who was the promoter I talked about from Aztec, former RAF navigator, flew squadrons based in England, Gambia and North Africa, travelled from there to New York and London to establish contacts in Broadway and West End, and then ended up as a promoter of music in Australia, including Gene Pitney, Duane Eddy, the guitarist, Bob Dylan, Dave Brubeck, Eartha Kitt.
This is a serious operator.
But something of a cultural social marker. He'd had unprecedented success in bringing one particular BBC program here for an intended 6-month tour of Australia and New Zealand. It was unprecedented, eventually lasting for over 3 years from 1962 to 65, breaking box office records in both countries, which apparently still stood for
Come on, out with
decades.
it, Gareth. I'm intrigued.
Black and white minstrel
Black
show.
and white minstrel show.
Right. So do you have any recollections of that being
God, you
rerun?
are doing my head in, mate.
So
because
how massive was this?
Because
did you show this in Wollongong?
They certainly did. And not only that, we sat down, my parents sat down along with every other person in Wollongong and Sydney and Australia. It was a high-rating TV show. You've just triggered
triggered some memories here.
You've triggered a very poignant memory. So my parents moved into their new house, which they built in 1967, and the first item that they purchased, or one of the first items, was a second-hand black and white TV, a HMV, and they hadn't got a lounge yet, but we sat down and we watched the TV, and I recall quite distinctly the black and white minstrel show coming on. But what I also remember quite distinctly, and this speaks to the relations between newly arrived migrants and how they were received, often warmly by neighbours and friends. We had our neighbour at the time was an aging, quite an old digger from the First World War, Mr. Gemmell, and Mr. Gemmell would dress up in his formal three-piece suit. He would come and watch TV at 7:30 on Friday night. I remember distinctly him and my parents and myself, a very young lad, watching the black and white minstrel show. So that's incredible that you've picked that up. What it's got to do with the Beatles, I don't know.
Well, this is another element of our cultural environment.
Correct.
Because this is 1962 to 65.
Oh, of course, and it was promoted by...
And this is promoted by Ken Brodziak, who bought the Beatles out. This was the big show he'd landed to that point. As part of the tour, there was discussion of the Beatles having a side trip to meet some young women from Liverpool who were in the cast.
Oh, okay.
Right. The zeitgeist of the Beatles with the zeitgeist of
the black and white minstrel show.
And who would have been benefiting from that equation more, do you think?
Definitely the Beatles, mate. I mean,
Yeah, Australia. Think of satirical only with 4 musicians going through it. Hello, Cover. How's Wagga Wagga? I did but see her passing by, and yet I love her till I die.